Good evening. Welcome to our Wednesday evening study through the Psalms. I'm Pastor Stephen of Green Run Baptist Church, and on behalf of the elders and members, we appreciate your participation in our study. This evening, we will be examining Psalm 106. Psalm 106 actually flips the message of Psalm 105 on its head. Psalm 105 gave us a vivid picture of God's faithfulness um, in Israel's history, the events of Israel's history. God was always faithful, He was always good. Despite Israel's forgetfulness, despite Israel's faithlessness, God was good to them. Both Psalm 105 and 106 present a reflection of Israel's history. And like I said, beginning with God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Joseph's adversity and trials, the Exodus and the wilderness, God was faithful to his people. Psalm 106 picks up the story of Israel crossing the Red Sea. And Psalm 106 ends with Israel's Babylonian exile. Just as God was faithful to Israel in these past events, Israel was as faithless to God. As God was true to his covenant, Israel forgot it. In Psalm 105, the poet reminds Israel of God's purpose for them, multiplying them throughout the world. God's purpose was to have them evangelize the wicked nations, not to be corrupted by them. But Psalm 106 recounts Israel's failure, how they went from a holy, beloved, covenanted people to people that were corrupted by the nations around them. And eventually, God gives them up to slavery and puts them into exile. The opening 5 verses of Psalm 106 are a call to praise. God is faithful, and so we are called to praise his faithfulness. God is forever good, and so we are to acknowledge his goodness. The scripture says in 106, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. And this is indispensable formula. God is fundamentally good. He is fundamentally loving to his people. Who can proclaim the mighty acts of the Lord? That is a rhetorical question. Instead of answering the question, well, let me sit down and let me think of who can proclaim the mighty acts of the Lord. The purpose of the question is to compel you to think about all that God has done to preserve you, to protect you, and to prosper you. Giving thanks to the Lord, proclaiming his mighty acts are two impossible tasks for us to get perfectly right. Do you know that? As often as we sit down and meditate on God's goodness and what he has done for us, we will never get that perfect. And it's not because uh, for a lack of trying, it's because of how great God is and how good he has been to us. Blessed are those who act justly, who always do what is right. It's those who are in right relationship to God, obey God. When you disobey God, you fall out of relationship with him and you open yourself up to what? Troubles. Why do we have trouble in this world? Well, one of the reasons why we have trouble in this world is because we fall out of relationship with God. We turn our backs, we walk away, we live according to our own way. We forget the ways of God. But despite that, Psalm 105, 106 tells us that to his people, to you and I, who love the Lord, although we sin and we sin against God every day, and we live lives that sometimes can bring disrepute upon the Christian faith, and we do a lot of things that anger the Lord and should cause trouble to come upon us. God is still good to us. He forgives us. He loves us. In verses 6 through 12, we begin the conversation of Israel's past. And I want to remind you, before we actually get involved in this study any further, I want to explain to you that it would be really wrong of us to point the finger at unbelieving Israel and think that although we may be remote from them, it would be a very dangerous assumption to make that we won't do the same things that they did. Jesus had this conversation with the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. In Luke chapter 11, verses 47 through 51, he says, you know what? You think that you're better than those who killed the prophets? You're their descendants. You're their sons. You're just as evil as they were. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the Apostle Paul recalls some of these same events that we're about to talk about here and that we talked about last week in Psalm 105. And Paul says their actions serve as a reminder for us that take heed lest you fall. But the writer of Psalm 106 doesn't want to fall by the same temptations as his ancestors did. And so he confesses the sinfulness of those things. And he kind of puts up a barrier around his own heart to protect himself from falling into those same temptations. How do you guard from falling into the same sins as you previously committed or someone else committed before you? By acknowledging that those things are sinful, that they're not good, that nothing good comes from them. You know, in the book of Romans, Paul, talking about his former life and our former life of sin, what he says, what fruit came from that? What good? The life that you lived, the sinful life that you lived, what good came from that? And the answer is nothing. And so if we go ahead and recognize in our hearts, like, hey, those things were sinful, those things were bad, nothing good came of those things, that's step one from guarding your heart of falling back into it. And so reflecting on these events, the psalmist says, you know what, reflecting on these events, not pointing a finger at those guys, but reflecting upon the temptations that they fell into would give us a sober understanding that we could fall in that same way. When you put yourself on a higher pedestal, saying, you know, I would never sin like that, and this is pointing at me. There you open any search engine and you search for pastor, they're all falling away. Well, not all of them. A lot of them are falling away. And so this is a reminder for myself that I look at men like Steve Lawson, Samuel Renahan, and it's more for myself that I'm speaking to you. And so I can't put myself on a higher pedestal like, oh, I would never do that. I hope I would not do that. I have to have accountability, wisdom, knowing that that these things are sinful and that they ruin lives, they ruin careers, they bring disrepute upon God's people, they bring disrepute upon God, the Christian faith. Like the world mocks the Christian faith because of the way Christians live. And it's not the good mocking. And it's not because of the good way that we live. Of course, the world's going to mock the way that we live, no matter if we live bad or evil, but it's the kind of mocking. I'd rather the world mock us for living righteous life, for guarding against temptation, than mocking us for falling into it. And so don't place yourself at a great spiritual risk by being unaware that those who came before you and their failures can easily become yours. In verse 7 of Psalm 106, the poet wants us to consider not to be careless in our thoughts about rebellion, but to consider, to reflect, to have some kind of contemplation that leads to insight and understanding, come to the realization that God's miraculous works are to be studied. They're not to be passed over. That God's work in your life is something that's not to be taken for granted. Because the more we take God's work in our life for granted, we open ourselves up for a lot of spiritual harm. Forgetting God's works is forgetting God's kindness. Forgetting God's work in your life is equal to forgetting his love. Because the things that God does to you, does for you and to you, is born out of his love that he has for you. It's born out of his kindness. I mean, how quickly do the Israelites forget about God's kindness when they arrived at the Red Sea? Immediately, they come to the edge of the beach and they're crossing the Red Sea. The waters are too high. And they look behind them. Pharaoh's army is coming and closer and closer. They're coming to take over them and to kill them, maybe even bring them back to Egypt as slaves. They immediately assume the worst. They complain against God. And so God parts that Red Sea. Although they witnessed 10 plagues in Egypt that God did against their adversaries, they immediately complain about God's power and love for them. But God saved them because of his own namesake. God saved Israel because he was true to himself, not because of how they responded to him. God didn't look down in the quarters of time and say, well, if I do this for Israel, they'll love me and they'll thank me. No, he did this for his reputation, because the people that he just brought out of slavery, if they are overtaken by their same adversaries in the wilderness, God's going to be mocked. And so even when we are faithless, God is always faithful to himself. He cannot deny himself. For God to be faithless towards his people is for him to deny his own self, his own power, his own love, and his own kindness. You can read that later in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 through 13. After the Lord leads Israel safely through the Red Sea and the Egyptian army is drowned, the poet then moves to the wilderness in verses 13 through 18 of Psalm 106. How did Israel respond to what God did for them at the Red Sea? The scripture says they soon forgot. All too soon after they experienced God's mighty deliverance at the Red Sea, their selective amnesia returns and they rebel. In what way did they rebel against God in the wilderness? Well, they were impatient. They didn't wait for his plan to unfold. And let me tell you, and you know this, impatience leads to a whole load of sins. I was once told by a professor that impatience is the child of pride and unbelief. That's what it is. If pride and unbelief could have a child, they would birth impatience. And that's the problem with Israel. They were prideful, and in their midst, almost the entire nation was unbelievers. And so when you mix a people who are prideful, who want their things their way right then at their time, when they think it's owed to them, plus they're unbelievers, that is going to create impatience, and impatience leads us into sin. Impatience leads us to try to do things our way, and usually our way means circumvent laws, circumvent God's rules. When you're impatient, you cut out the middleman, which is God's law, and you just handle things your way to try to get that quick, satisfying relief as fast as you can. And so they were prideful, they were unbelievers, and they were impatient. Frustration. When we do not control what happens in our lives, or when something happens in our lives, that frustration leads to impatience. And we see that dynamic in the wilderness. After the Lord delivers the Israelites from Egyptian bondage, they forget about God. They forget about his works. They forget what he did for them. They want everything now. They don't want to wait. And so they rebel against the Lord. Remember when they entered the wilderness and they set out after they crossed the Red Sea and they had to go around the land of Edom? The people became impatient because they thought this way was out of the way. Well, in reality, if they would have cut through the land, the Edomites would have destroyed them. They would have been killed by the Edomites. But they don't know that because they're impatient. They speak against God. Carried them out of Egypt. He walked them through the Red Sea. He wiped out the Egyptians behind them. He fed them with food from heaven, water from a rock. They still grew impatient. Why? Because the life God had promised them, the kind of life that they really wanted, did not come fast enough. The path that God had chosen for them was longer and harder and more painful than they expected. And so they grew angry that they could not control their lives. They became so angry that they even began to desire, to long for the cruelty of Pharaoh. They thought God was more cruel than Pharaoh. And let me tell you, our impatience has a lot in common with them. We don't get to decide our lives. We don't get to decide whether our children will cooperate at any given moment. We don't get to decide how much traffic we'll be in. We don't get to decide when we'll get sick, which appliance will fail, how often interruptions will come in our lives. There are so many decisions that are made for us every single day without ever consulting with us. And our lack of self-control, our lack of, humility, when life interrupts what we thought we had planned and we're forced to wait, we grumble. We raise our fist to God. Don't you dare for 1 second think you don't, because you certainly do. In verses 19 through 20 of Psalm 106, one of the most absurd things ever happens. The Israelites make an idol from metal, and they declare that this inanimate object is the living God who saved them from Israel. Isn't that crazy? That they thought an object that they made with their hands was the God who led them out of slavery. The place where their hands could not lead them out of. They were stuck over 400 years. Although at the beginning they had more numbers than the Egyptians. Remember that? Remember the Egyptians said, these people are growing and soon they're going to overtake us, so let's go ahead and make them slaves now. The place where they could not free themselves, they thought that this little statue that they created in the wilderness, that statue is the one that did it. And not only that, this was done at the foot of Mount Sinai, the place where God revealed himself with thunder and lightning. The people were scared. They knew they were in God's presence. And while God was up there talking to Moses, and he surrounded Moses with a thick cloud and thunder and lightning, other than the incarnation of the Son of God, other than Jesus, the Son of God, becoming man, there's no greater revelation than Mount Sinai. But that pathetic truth that they exchanged the glory of God for an image of an animal which eats grass. Not even the real thing, an image of the real thing. I mean, could there possibly be anything that's more absurd than believing that an image, a picture, a statue of a cow saved you from slavery? They've seen the miracles that were worked through the plagues, the Passover, passing the Red Sea, water from the rock, bread from heaven, the theophany at Sinai, and then to think and to make an idol from metal, which they knew, right? They weren't dumb. They were just corrupted by sin. They weren't dumb. They knew that statue had nothing to do with their release from Egypt. What an ultimate absurdity. And so the Israelites forgot about the Lord in Egypt. They forgot about the Lord leaving Egypt. They forgot about the Lord in the wilderness. And they also forget about the Lord while living in the promised land. Verses 24 through 27, the poet of Psalm 106 addresses the people's response to the report of the land. They're not even in the land yet. They're on the doorstep of the land. And they send those spies. Those spies come back and, they're too big. The Israelites hear the news. They grumble. They rather go back to Egypt again. And so God makes them a promise. He says, those of you who are grumbling, you will die in the wilderness and you will not go into the promised land. Friends, listen to me. Unbelief has significant consequences. Faithlessness is a cross, or has a cross-generational impact. It resonates down through the ages. It was true for the Israelites. It's true for us. You show me a mother and father that they reject God, despise the church, and live according to their own sinful standards. And you have a whole house full of children who believe the same. It is an absolute rare to find a family of 5 where mom, dad, and 2 other children are unbelievers, but finally that one child bucks the trend and has faith in God. That's rare. Because faithlessness resonates. Faithlessness resonates through the ages. And we see that. We see that here with Israel. We see it here. We saw it in the book of Judges. Faithlessness is cross-generational, man. It resonates down through the line. If you couldn't think that Israel's history could get any worse, well, you got to keep reading Psalm 106 and verses 28 through 31. It goes even further into a nosedive. Even the best Israelites like Moses and Phinehas could not save that generation from their rebellion. In verse 28, while they lived in the land of Canaan, instead of destroying everyone and kicking everybody out, they allowed some evil, wicked men to live. And so they adopt their practices. And one of the practices that the Israelites adopted was abortion. They sacrificed their own children. They killed their own children. Woo! Again, we have to put this in perspective now. This is the same nation of people that when Pharaoh decided to kill their infant sons in the book of Exodus, remember that? And then the Hebrew midwives were like, nah, we're not going to go through that. We'd rather lie to Pharaoh than kill children, our children. What they believed about life in the womb. I mean, they believe that, read Psalm 139. They believe that God created everything. Even the life in the womb was created by God, although husband and wife come together and they procreate through sexual activity. They believe that God's blessing on that one. When women couldn't have children, that was because of the Lord. He closed up the womb. And so the Israelites believed 100% that life was controlled by God. And here they are acting like God and taking away that life. You want to talk about an opposite, a total reversal of their worldview. And it all started in verses 34 through 39 by not striking down all their enemies. The Lord instructed them back in Deuteronomy chapter 7, even before they spied out the land, even before they came to the doorstep of the land. Listen, I'm taking you to the promised land. And when you get there, you have to destroy everyone. Because this is the problem with believers dating unbelievers or marrying unbelievers. We think that we are going to change them. But instead, the opposite almost always happens. The unbelieving spouse corrupts the believing one, and eventually the family just stops going to church. The believing spouse just gives up the faith, walks away to what they once professed to believe. And the Israelites, that happened with them. They turn their back on God. They begin killing their own children. They worship false gods. I mean, what an unbelievable practice. Terrible. If I had to sum up Psalm 105 and 106 in one way, it's this right here. walk in a worthy manner of which God has called you. Walk in a worthy manner. God called the nation of Israel, and he called them, their calling was to be distinct from all the other nations. They were to live differently. They were to live holy lives, separate lives, faithful lives, obeying God, worshiping God. That's what God called them to do, beginning with Abraham. But they did not walk in a worthy manner of that calling. Let me read to you Ephesians chapter 4. This is the Apostle Paul writing to the church at Ephesus, which is mainly Gentiles. And listen to what the apostle says in chapter 4, verse 1 to the Christian church. He says, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope that belongs to your call, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. So Paul says that, remember, Ephesians chapter 4 is 4 chapters after Ephesians chapter 1, where Paul explains to the church that they have been predestined to be believers. That God, before they were born, before they did anything good or bad, before God created them, before he created the world, Paul says in Ephesians 1, that God has chosen a certain number of people that he would save. He predestined them to become adopted sons. And then at some point in their life, God reveals himself to them through the gospel, and they believe, and they actually become adopted sons. So it's that calling, this massive calling, divine calling that God has placed upon the church, his believing people, that we are to walk worthy of that calling. Well, what do you think that means? To walk worthy of the calling in which we were called is to match the majesty of it, the righteousness of it, the good of it. I mean, how wonderful, how beautiful, how great do you think God's calling of sinners out of darkness and into light is? It ain't nothing better than that. That's the best calling in the world. And so that's a very worthy calling. And so Paul tells us that we have to live a life that matches that. Because if we don't, we bring disrepute upon that calling. Think of the calling of the elders in 1 Timothy chapter 3, Titus chapter 1, and 1 Peter chapter 5. The apostles say that anyone who desires the task of an elder desires a noble task. The office of an elder, that position inside the church, is absolutely righteous and perfect. God called, he created that office. And so us elders, we are called to live according to that extravagant call. That's why we have qualifications. We can't do this, 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 and this. Paul lists a whole bunch of qualifications, because if we live in a way that's greedy and dishonest and we all these terrible sins, and we live this terrible life, we bring disrepute upon the calling of the elder. The same thing with Israel. God called them, of all the nations, God called, he had a special calling for them. But because of the way they lived in an unworthy manner of that calling. They proved themselves to be unworthy of it. Walk worthy of the calling to which you were called. God has placed the calling of the church very high. It's held high. It's the highest calling in the world. So much so that angels, they long to look into it. And so we are to live lives worthy of that calling. We are to match how great that calling is. That means our lives have to be lived out in a holy and righteous way, or else we find ourselves to be unworthy of that calling. Thanks for listening. This coming week we'll have Psalm 107. So I'll see you soon. Thank you.